All right, everybody, I want to welcome you to Pastor's Point of View. Today is, interestingly enough, September 11th, 2020, where we, sort of reflect back on the terrible event that happened, 19 years ago?
Yes, sir.
So our hearts and thoughts and prayers go out to was it 3,000 people? There was at least 3,000 people, maybe a little under that.
It was just under that number total.
That were killed in our country due to what we think is consistent Islamic aggression. Anyway, my name is Dr. Andy Woods. This is Pastor's Point of View number 137. Brother Jim, Pastor Jim, Dr. Jim continues to recover from shoulder surgery, so we're blessed once again to have Sugarland Bible Church member and someone that has a heart for politics and worldview, Tom Lee Bench, back again. So thanks for interrupting your busy life to be with us. We're going to continue talking about what I think is the story of our lifetime, which is the planetary reset due to COVID-19. And the world is being set up like it's never been set up before for the end times, I think, because of COVID-19. And not so much COVID-19, but the global reaction to COVID-19. And we like to use as a biblical entry point Daniel 7, verse 19, verse 23, and verse 25, which speaks of what is developing before our very eyes. The next kingdom on the horizon is not Christ's kingdom, according to the chronology in Daniel 7, but it's the Antichrist kingdom. And that's what's being built right now. And I don't expect the church to be here when this kingdom is in full operation, but I think the forming of it can be seen even this side of the rapture. So Daniel 7 speaks of that fourth beast who's going to come and crush and trample down the remainder, and his kingdom is going to devour the whole earth, which speaks of the coming one world government of the Antichrist. And from that kingdom will arise a little horn who will basically usher in the new normal. He will intend, I think it's verse 25, intend to make alterations in times and law. So everything that's normal will be swept out, and everything that is the new normal will be swept in. And so that's the sort of climate humanity will find itself in on the eve of the rapture and on the eve of the second advent of Christ. We also like to use Revelation 13, 16 through 18, which says he will cause all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, to receive a mark on their right hand or forehead, preventing them from buying or selling unless they have this mark. And we think, and we can't be dogmatic about it, but we think that the vaccinations that are coming is certainly, if it's not that system, it's preparatory for it. It's putting the psychology in place that you can't even participate in the economy, unless you have the right insignia. And we believe that this system that is spoken of in the Bible is not just spoken of in Daniel 7, but it's also spoken of under this slide here, Satan's goal of globalism, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, several passages there, and Revelation 17 and verse 15. So with that in mind, we're going to be taking a look today at a lot of issues that are paving the way for that system. And so we've entitled this Planetary Reset, and those are the 6 items that we're going to look at today. CRT progress, critical race theory progress, the international crackdown related to COVID-19, the domestic crackdown due to COVID-19, the world being caught up in the Chicken Little mentality, because that's the strategy that's being used to usher us into this system, global Marxism coming from the UN, and then the so-called new normal related to morality. So that's the direction we're headed in. Let's start here with critical race theory progress. Now, in our last show together, I think it was number 136, we dealt with in depth a whole hour and a half, actually more than an hour and a half, critical race theory, and how that is a false gospel, how that is actually a Marxist tool to divide and tear down the greatest civilization that's ever been built, the United States of America. And America is largely in the way of this trajectory into globalism. And so America has to kind of disappear or become marginalized. And it is interesting that when you study the pages of Bible prophecy, you don't find the United States anywhere. And this could be the very tool that Satan will use to divide and tear down. I would encourage people to go back and watch number 136, where we dealt with that in depth. But I just want to give people a little bit of insight into how critical race theory has penetrated almost every vestige of the United States of America. For example, we have this article from harbingersdaily.com entitled "Woke Northwestern Law Faculty Introduce Themselves as Racists" on online town hall dated September the 10th, I guess, which was yesterday, 2020. And this sort of you get up in front of students or you get up in front of fellow faculty members at elite institutions and you do all this self-loathing, and you apologize for being white. That's like in vogue today. All these academics are doing this. So do you mind reading some of that article to us?
Northwestern University Law School faculty.
Which, by the way, is a very elite law school.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're not talking about second-rate academic strata here.
Yeah. Northwestern University Law School faculty called themselves racists as they introduced themselves in an online town hall recently, according to a screenshot of the event. The screenshot was obtained by conservative writer Rod Dreher, who noted in his tweet the meeting took place August 28. Everybody, and this is a quote, everybody began with the ritual denunciation of themselves as racist. Reader, Professor Speta is not a racist. He is a wonderful man universally loved by students. It makes me sad that he is forced to say otherwise, end quote, Dreher tweeted. Emily Mullen, listed as the university's executive director of major gifts, introduced herself as, quote, a racist and a gatekeeper of white supremacy, end quote, and she said she will, quote, work to do better, end quote. She did not respond to requests asking her why she did this, whether she was coerced, what the goal of the exercise was, whose idea it was, and several other emailed questions sent at least 3 times last week. The deputy director of the law school's Bloom Legal Clinic, Sarah Sommerveld, also said she is, quote, is a racist and will try to do better, end quote. Professor James Speta, currently the interim dean of Northwestern University's law school, wrote in the meeting chat, quote, I'm Jim Speta and I am a racist, end quote.
So that's how the Zoom meeting starts. One professor admits he's a racist and promises to do better. The executive director of major gifts to the school does the same thing. And then the clinic legal director, Sarah Sommervold, basically comes out and says she's a racist and she'll try to do better. And this gentleman, a conservative apparently, Rod Dreher, if I'm pronouncing that right, captured this on his tweet, where he writes, Northwestern University Law School had a town meeting online recently. Everyone began with a ritual. Now that's an interesting choice of words. You get the feeling that this is some kind of religion. Ritual denunciation of themselves, and then Dreher, is kind of defending this Professor Speta, who I guess is coerced into saying this, that he's not a racist, he's a wonderful man. And we have this slide here where it's a screenshot taken of all of these professors, at this Zoom meeting, saying that they are racist. So unfortunately, that's sort of the new normal. I know of one particular professor at an evangelical school, and that's how he starts his classes. He apologizes, for being a white male, So this is the outworking of what we were talking about last time, critical race theory. And do you have anything you want to add on that?
Well, I saw the emphasis of Emily Mullen, major gifts. So that sounds like she's someone out there trying to obtain donations and monies for the school. So I would assume that's part of what her motivation is to ensure that money stream continues. But what really struck me on this was, thank the Lord for making this visible.
Yes.
If this is an online town hall because they can't do the event in person, otherwise we probably wouldn't have any documentation, we wouldn't have any screenshots, things of that sort. But because they're all having to log in, then there's opportunity to screenshot this so that then you can bring this to the audience.
Absolutely. Well, cheer up, folks. It gets worse. I was just handed this local newspaper entitled Community Impact Newspaper from the Sugar Land, Missouri City area, which is our immediate area. And the title of it is Missouri City Amends Street Naming Policy. And it says in July and August, Missouri City Council unanimously approved changes to 2 sections of the city code related to street naming and renaming process. The council's actions come after some street name and subdivision names have come under scrutiny from council members and the community for the words plantation or bearing names of Civil War battles and Confederate generals. So anything with the name plantation on it, here locally, or anything that would bear the name of a Civil War battle or a Confederate general, if your street happens to be named after something like that, then it has to go, according to the local city council. Have you heard about this before?
No. And this would be...
Here's the local newspaper here. We don't have a screenshot of it, but this was just handed to me, and I wanted to make our folks aware of that.
Well, some of those Civil War battles were decisive victories for the Union. Okay.
So why do those go? But this is very common in critical race theory. What do they call this? Cancel culture movement.
Cancel culture.
And it relates to the kind of syrup you use, whether it's Aunt Jemima syrup or not. And it relates right down to the names of something as seemingly innocuous as the name of your street address. And what bothers me as a pastor is not only to see this as an attorney also go into the law school academia, but it goes into the churches. And here we have religion and race, the United Methodist Church, and it's speaking here of a particular liturgy or prayer now that's being offered. The title of it is Great Thanksgiving, Black Lives Matter by Michael Johnson, Reverend Michael Johnson, and this is how the liturgy is going to start. It says, the Lord be with you, and I guess the emboldened part of it is the congregation's response. I grew up with this style in the Episcopalian Church. The Lord be with you and also with you. Lift up your hearts. We lift them up to the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is right to give him thanks and praise. So far, so good.
Right.
Now, what does the rest of the liturgy say, if you don't mind reading that?
Black lives matter to you and always have. Black lives matter. Black male lives matter. Black female lives matter. Black female trans lives matter. Black female trafficked lives matter. Black gay lives matter. Black uneducated as well as educated lives matter. Black poor as well as rich lives matter. Black homeless lives matter. Black Christians and non-Christians matter. Black lives with disabilities matter. Black immigrants and refugees matter. Black children matter. Black teens matter. Their lives are sacred. Their lives are valuable. Their lives are precious. Their lives are important. Their lives are necessary. Their lives are integral to your magnificent, beloved family.
So you're reading your liturgy at the United Methodist Church, and all of a sudden they start reading all this stuff about black lives, gay lives, black children matter. This is an outworking of the Gramsci strategy. This is what Gramsci said. He said, you've got to get this Marxism to work, you can't do the Blitzkrieg model. What you've got to do is you've got to penetrate every area of society, whether it's academia, the arts, religion, and that's how you topple a culture. And Gramsci must be just, I mean, he's not alive right now. I'm sure he's in hell, but if he was alive today, he would be dancing in the streets at his success related to his strategy concerning the toppling of the United States of America, watching leading law faculty incorporate critical race theory, watching a church, the United Methodist Church, as part of its liturgy, incorporating critical race theory. Now, my friend Brandon House, in his book Religious Trojan Horse, page 47, has a wonderful description of the Gramsci model. We read it last time, but let's refresh ourselves on that.
Antonio Gramsci advised World War II dictator Benito Mussolini that violence was not the way to bring about a lasting revolution people would embrace and maintain. Gramsci wrote eloquently of a quiet revolution, one that would transform a culture from within by changing the basic worldview of each and every institution in society.
Now, aren't we in the middle of, I would say, here in the United States, a quiet revolution? I mean, I would argue we're probably deeper into it than we realize.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
He also cautioned that this revolution would be, quote, a long march through the institutions, end quote, not a blitzkrieg of change. So clear was his strategic thinking that Gramsci targeted Christianity specifically as the greatest...
Like the United Methodist Church,
yes,
sorry.
As the greatest philosophical adversary along the way. Later in the 20th century, Gramsci's vision captivated another rising neo-Marxist who codified the Gramsci dream in a 1971 book, Rules for Radicals, a pragmatic primer for realistic radicals. In it, Saul Alinsky detailed the need to penetrate the middle class and reorganize from within. Alinsky articulated tactics for infiltrating every conceivable social institution, including churches.
There you have it. And I want people to understand, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about last week, but when you're going into a church and there is a specific racial group that is, extolled or exonerated or, brought to the forefront, that is putting a barrier into the church that God didn't put there. Because the gospel's for everybody.
Right.
It's not Black Lives Matter, it's all lives matter. And Jesus specifically said when he gave us our marching orders for the Great Commission in Matthew 28, verse 19, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. He never said target one particular nation or one particular group. And in the body of Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, Galatians 3:28. Neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And that stops being respected when you have liturgy like this. And we also have Ephesians 2, verse 14, which Paul the Apostle writes, for he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. That's the function and the nature, of the church. And consequently, one race, whether it's white, Asian, Caucasian, Hispanic, you name it, is not to be targeted. And yet that's exactly what this critical race theory does, because what it does at the end of the day is it will divide Christian against Christian, American against American, and that's what Saul Alinsky, reading from the Gramsci Playbook, said. You've got to get the country divided against itself. You've got to take areas of resentment and rub them raw, and it's easier to topple that way. And so this is all the outworking of this critical race theory, whether it's your syrup, your street sign, your liturgy that you're using in your church, and even what your law school faculty and fundraisers are saying, at the beginning of Zoom meetings. And you got something you want to add to that?
I was just going to say they're all special interest groups.
Yes. And I praise the Lord for Trump and what he just did recently. Right after we got off the air, gosh, he must have listened to our broadcast, right? Right after we got off the air, we learned that Trump banned, this is an article from the Daily Wire, Trump banned federal money from funding far left anti-American critical race theory. And the point of it is, look, if you are receiving federal money, you cannot indoctrinate your employees into critical race theory. If you indoctrinate your employees into critical race theory, then no more money for you. And so the article says the Trump administration announced late on Friday, right after our show, by the way, that it was cracking down on critical race theory, a far left anti-American ideology that promotes racial division, from being taught in federal agencies and paid for by federal money. And I would just say this, people can think whatever they want about Donald Trump, but this is the kind of thing that makes me want to stand up and cheer the man, because he is at least countering, to the best of his ability, this influence of critical race theory, taking place at all the levels of our culture as we speak. Anything you want to toss in there on that before we switch subjects?
Proverbs says something about the king is like in the hands of the Lord. And I just think, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, if memory serves, Proverbs 21, verse 1, which talks about how the king's heart is like water in a water course. And just as a water course directs the water wherever it needs to go, the Lord directs the king's heart. And so this is a great reason to stay up to speed and stay in prayer, for our political leaders, because they can make very strategic decisions, which neutralize the Marxist critical race theory game out there.
Right.
All right, well, let's switch to number 2. And this has to do with how COVID-19 is ushering in international crackdowns. And I wanted to cover this category because we in the United States have a tendency to think the United States is the center of everything, and we're kind of unaware of what's happening in the rest of the world. But whatever incursions of our freedoms are taking place here in the United States, it is far worse internationally. And I have a lot of friends. We've got a lot of listeners, a lot of wonderful people in Australia that listen to us regularly. And they send me clips and articles and things that just are stunning to me, the crackdown on freedoms that are happening in Australia, and we're also going to cover, just a minute, Canada. But here we have an article from, let's see, the Daily Mail again. Actually, the other one was the Daily Wire. This one's the Daily Mail, and the title of it is Extraordinary Moment, Pregnant Mum, notice the different spelling there, international article, is arrested and handcuffed in front of her 2 children. I can't believe this. Over a Facebook post? You're that exercised about a Facebook post about lockdown moments before she was due to an ultrasound? And we've got a screenshot of her there in cuffs, being handcuffed, which we'll show you in just a second. But what is that article all about?
Yes. A pregnant woman has been arrested in her own home over a Facebook post allegedly inciting anti-lockdown protest in Victoria. Zoe Lee Buhler,
in Australia.
Yes. Zoe Lee Buhler, age 28, was handcuffed in her lounge room in front of her children and partner on Wednesday afternoon and charged with incitement. Several officers entered the house in Miners Rest, Ballarat, northwest of Melbourne, with a search warrant and began reading the young mother her rights. Quote, "Excuse me, incitement for what? What on earth? I'm in my pajamas. My 2 kids are here," end quote, she said, clearly confused. Continuing, quote, "I have an ultrasound in an hour because I'm pregnant," end quote. Ms. Buhler's alleged offending post linked to a since-deleted Freedom Day Ballarat event she created for 11 a.m. on Saturday on Sturt Street. "Anyone from Ballarat, please join us in our fight for freedom and human rights," she wrote on Sunday with a link to the event page. The increasingly distressed mother insisted she wasn't breaking any laws by creating and then promoting the event. Miss Buller was distressed by this point and crying so much she could barely tell officers that she didn't realize she was doing anything wrong in making the online event. Police said they would seize all electronic devices in the house, including those belonging to Mr. Timmons and Miss Buller's sister. Miss Buller was later charged with incitement and released on bail to face Ballarat Magistrates Court on January 25 of next year. Her friends and family were horrified when they learned of the arrest via a Facebook post. Quote, "This is absolutely disgusting. Why don't they do their job and catch some real criminals?
Yeah.
This fear-mongering is ridiculous," one friend said. "This cannot be legal," another one added.
So this is the climate that's been ushered in due to COVID-19. You notice the complaint here is, why don't they catch some real criminals? This is what's bugged me about this from day one, is ordinary law-abiding citizens are now being criminalized and they're under suspicion because of COVID-19. And what did she do? I mean, she set up a Facebook event, and that was grounds for the authorities to come and take this pregnant woman who's due for an ultrasound in front of her children, I guess it says, into handcuffs. I mean, this is the type of insanity that is taking place all over, not just the United States. I think we see a little bit less of this in the United States, although we have given some reporting of things like this happening in the U.S. But internationally, it's far worse. You have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I had a couple comments.
Yes.
So January 25, I wonder when her due date is and if she's going to be full term.
Good point.
And she's distressed to the point of crying. Can you imagine either being close to your due date and having to go to court? I think this is cruel and unusual.
Punishment.
And, you know, too bad. I don't know if they have something similar to the Eighth Amendment, but I wish they'd go after these so-called law enforcement. And then the other thing is, she's creating an online event. Isn't this an online event?
What we're doing here?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. So are the authorities going to kick down the door at any minute? Not the least of which is what kind of damage is being done to her unborn child going through this trauma.
Yeah.
Well, we have also this situation in Quebec. So now we're moving to Canada. Quebec City says it will isolate uncooperative citizens in secret corona facility. Health officials also visiting homes to take people away who violate quarantine. This is from the Summit News. Why don't you read the first couple paragraphs there?
Okay. Authorities in Quebec City, Canada, have announced they will isolate, scare quote, uncooperative citizens in a coronavirus facility, the location of which remains a secret. During a press conference, Dr. Jacques Girard, who heads the Quebec City Public Health Authority, drew attention to a case where patrons at a bar were ordered to wait until their COVID-19 test came back, but disregarded the command and left the premises before the results came back positive. This led to them being deemed, scare quote, uncooperative and forcibly interned in a quarantine facility. Quote, "We may isolate someone for 14 days, Girard said during the press conference. Continue, quote, "And it is what we did this morning, forced a person to cooperate with the investigation, and police cooperation was exceptional."
And the article goes on and people can read all about this. But, you know, it's to a situation now where you have actual facilities carved out for uncooperative people. And we were trying to look up the term a little bit earlier, but the Marxists have a category for this. It's something to the effect of disappearing persons or disappearance of persons. And that's what this reminds me of, you know, where people are actually being quarantined in particular facilities in Quebec. And for all intents and purposes, because they're uncooperative, they disappear for a while. And you go forward, by the way, at the very end of this article says, as we previously highlighted, the government of New Zealand announced similar measures, saying that they will put all new coronavirus infectees and their close family members in quarantine facilities. From there, we go to the UK, where we have this Breitbart article, which says UK gatherings of more than 6 are banned as government reportedly mulls curfew. Do you mind reading that article to us by Victoria Friedman, September 9th, 2020?
The British government is set to reimpose strict legal limitations on public gatherings, and it is reportedly considering a draconian national curfew. Prime Minister Boris Johnson will announce today that from Monday, social gatherings of more than 6 will be banned in England following a rise in confirmed coronavirus cases. Ministers blame the increase on families interacting and young people having social lives, with the government predicting a second wave.
So that's what's happening in Victoria, Quebec, the UK. And just when you thought things could not get more intrusive, we have this article from CNN.com. It says, wear a mask while having sex and avoid kissing new people, Canada's top doctor advises. And I'll go ahead and read this. It says,
okay.
Dr. Teresa Tam. Now, Teresa Tam is interesting because she's actually on a video made several years ago predicting this whole pandemic or plandemic. You get the idea that a lot of this was sort of manufactured ahead of time. We've done prior shows on that. But it says Teresa Tam, Canada's chief public health officer, issued a public statement Wednesday on staying safe from the virus while engaging in sexual activities. A trusting relationship should first be established, and partners should consider using a mask that covers the nose and the mouth, Tam says. Now, I find this interesting because apparently these COVID limitations know absolutely no boundaries whatsoever. Going right into the most intimate thing a human being can experience, a sexual relationship with somebody else, and the mask orders, at least according to the doctor's recommendation, and she's no low-ranking person, she's the chief public health officer, is saying those masks should be in place even when having sexual relations. Comments, if
Yes.
you have any.
I find it interesting that she's imposing a morality. Promiscuity is discouraged. They're catching up to us.
That's a good point. The double
You
standards.
know, because they always accuse us of imposing morality upon others.
And ever since I was coming of age as a Christian conservative, I remember the left always saying over and over again, keep the government out of my bedroom. So here, obviously the opposite is happening as espoused by the left. Now, just so people don't think it's all easy here in the United States, we have a third category that we're looking at, domestic COVID-19 crackdowns. Domestic, I'm using that as within the borders of our own country. And I came across this very troubling article from the Ohio Star. The first time you read something like this, you want to think it's fake news because we've been hearing about FEMA camps from time immemorial, and all the crazies are the ones that believe in FEMA camps. But you come into this article here, it's entitled State Orders Public Colleges and Universities to Create COVID-19 Quarantine Shelters. And this was actually put into force by, is his first name Mike DeWine?
Yes.
The governor of, Ohio. And he's cooperating here with FEMA in the process, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And does this not look like the FEMA sort of prisons that all of the so-called crazies have been telling us about for a long time? But anyway, what is that article about?
Ohio will now mandate public colleges and universities to create non-congregate sheltering space for quarantining coronavirus patients. Ohio Department of Health Interim Director Lance Himes issued the order Sunday to prevent the spread of COVID-19. alongside Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor John Husted. According to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, relative to COVID-19, non-congregate shelters are locations where each individual or household has living space that offers some level of privacy, such as hotels, motels, or dormitories. FEMA entered into an agreement with the state, which in part allows people to apply for the non-congregate sheltering. Under Himes' order, public colleges and universities must negotiate a mutual aid agreement with their local health board or the county or state emergency management agencies. The ODH calls these makeshift mandatory shelters temporary private medical facilities. Higher education may not be the only place these shelters will appear. The state's EMA now has the power to enter into contracts or mutual aid agreements with other public and private facilities. It's entirely possible under the order's language that certain non-congregate buildings, such as hotels and apartments, may be contracted or mandated for shelter use as well.
Yeah, we can stop there. People can read that article. We've got it cited there. But to me, it sounds an awful lot like what we just read about with Quebec, where it will isolate uncooperative citizens in a secret corona facility. I mean, how is that any different than what is happening in Ohio, as the government, FEMA, apparently is cooperating with public universities, hotels, dormitories, to house all of these people who are uncooperative?
Are they going to designate these dormitories to be only for COVID-19? Because, as a parent with a kid in college, I think along these lines of the amount of money that you invest and you enter this contract for this residency hall and the meals that are going to be provided, and they have just a few entrances and exits. So it's not as if you could leave that dormitory without encountering another person.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a healthy college student and their dormitory gets mandated as a non-congregate sheltering, and then the hotels and the apartments, now they're telling private property, well, we might contract with you, or we might just mandate.
Now, is that a Fifth Amendment violation? The government can't take private property without just compensation.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about Alinsky,
Mm-hmm.
and Alinsky warned that you can push something too far, and then you push it through to the other side, and now it becomes, a problem for you. Mm-hmm. And Ohio's a swing state.
Interesting points. So this is happening, folks, right here in the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And the reason we believe it's happening is because of what Daniel predicted, that the fourth kingdom will devour the whole earth.
Mm-hmm.
And it will change, the little horn when he comes is going to change the times and the laws. Certainly we're seeing that mentality in place, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
Even before the Antichrist
Mm-hmm.
arrives. And the tragic thing about all of this is all this crackdown we've talked about is completely and totally unnecessary, because the risk from COVID-19 has turned out to be far more negligible than what everybody thought was going to happen. And so this moves us into Roman numeral 4, where we're dealing with the Chicken Little mentality. Chicken Little, of course, you'll remember, is the one that said the sky is falling and the sky is falling. And the left has been saying the sky is falling for a long time. And the reason the left needs everybody to believe the sky is falling is we won't accept all of the draconian restrictions if people don't believe the sky is falling. And we see that with so-called climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And we see it with COVID-19. It turns out COVID-19 is barely, it hardly scratches the surface in terms of what was originally predicted in terms of worldwide casualties. And you look no further for proof of this than Sweden. Here's an article from Summit News. It says, Sweden close to victory over coronavirus. So what did Sweden do? Did they have a lockdown? Did they make everybody stay in their homes? No. The article goes on and it says they never had a lockdown or even a mask mandate. And this comes from an article September the 8th written by Stephen Watson. And what does that article say?
Okay, it starts with an excerpt. Sweden has gone from being the country with the most infections in Europe to the safest one. As the rest of Europe and the world remains under the grip of draconian rules and the threat of new lockdowns, Sweden, which allowed its citizens to remain free throughout the entire pandemic, has pretty much declared victory over the coronavirus. The country now has one of the lowest infection rates on the planet, and it's difficult not to admire how it has handled the past year with no strict lockdown or compulsory face mask rules. All businesses, schools, and public places remained open in Sweden for the duration. Quote, Sweden has gone from being the country with the most infections in Europe to the safest one, end quote, Sweden's senior epidemiologist Dr. Anders Tegnell commented to Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera.
Yeah. So isn't it interesting that the country with the least restrictions, in fact, if I'm interpreting this article right, no restrictions, has had the greatest victory over coronavirus. I'd be interested in seeing how the globalist spin machine, is going to handle that one. And along those same lines, we have this other article from westernjournal.com, and the title of it is Possibly Up to 90% of COVID positive Americans were not even contagious, says shock New York Times report by Michael Austin, August 31st, 2020. What does that say?
A shocking New York Times report published Saturday revealed that the novel coronavirus is not nearly as contagious as the American people were initially led to believe by experts. While America's COVID-19 testing can diagnose whether an individual has contracted the coronavirus, those tests have no way of parsing out just how much of the disease each subject has. As a result, individuals with almost no symptoms and little chance of spreading the disease have been testing positive. Quote, up to 90% of people testing positive carried barely any virus, a review by the Times found, end quote. The report read, this new information was released just days before the Center for Disease Control and Prevention released its own report showing that 94% of cases of those who died from COVID-19 had underlying comorbidities, meaning only 6% of COVID deaths were a direct result of just COVID-19.
So I remember when they were telling us the hospitals are going to swell and we're running low on ventilators and this and that. And here, this study comes out that indicates only 6% of COVID deaths were a result of just COVID-19. And folks, if there's a word you need to put in your vocabulary, as our vocabulary has been growing throughout this pandemic or plandemic, lots of new vocabulary words we're learning, like Wuhan. I didn't know where that was a few months ago. Mincome. Others we can think of. Learn this word. Put this on your vocabulary list. Comorbidities. Let me say that again. Comorbidities. All one word. And what that means is people not dying from COVID-19, but with COVID-19.
Right.
In other words, you can be diagnosed with COVID-19 and you could die from something completely unrelated to the disease. And in fact, if this study is right, 94% of the cases are in that category. So someone that dies at 80 years old just dies of old age, and they happen to have COVID-19 along the way. That's what's not being reported, is the distinction between dying of or dying with. And that's where that very important word, comorbidities, if I'm even pronouncing that right, that's the significance of it.
Right. It's like it's the feather that broke the camel's back.
That's right. Good point. The camel's back was breaking anyway.
Yeah.
And then you went up and petted it at the zoo, and now you get blamed for breaking the poor camel's back. And so I guess the question is, if COVID-19 is not the epidemic everybody thought it was, why are they hanging on to this? Why are they censoring from social media any information that would contradict the narrative that COVID-19 is killing everybody? Well, it goes back to the Rom Emmanuel Playbook. I'm embarrassed to read this quote again. We've read it so many times. You probably have it memorized. But let's just remind ourselves what Rom Emmanuel said. I think he made that statement concerning the financial meltdown in, 2008, 2009. At that time, he was functioning as chief of staff in the first term of the Obama administration. And what did he say?
You never let a serious crisis go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things you think you could not do before.
So if people are in a state of fear and panic, they will volitionally surrender their rights to some overarching government entity who promises to solve the problem for them. And we contend that the true virus is not the coronavirus, although we're not denying that it can be very serious, at least in the lives of a minority of people. But the true virus is the government apparatus that's being built as a consequence of this virus. And that's where it fits into the end time scenario and the biblical predictions about a government that will trample down the whole earth. And so that's where we see all of this stuff fitting together. And really what they want to do is they want to keep us in a state of fear until the vaccine is available. And if you're thumbs up about the vaccine, you really need to go on YouTube and listen to the recent remarks of Robert Kennedy. By the way, Robert Kennedy is no conservative.
That's right.
He's part of the Massachusetts Kennedy political dynasty. He would be on the opposite side of us probably on almost every issue, but he has become a tremendous outspoken critic of this vaccination and vaccinations in general, but this one coming out, this untested vaccine that all of us are expected to take. And that's why they're not going to let up on the gas on this, because they want to vaccinate everybody, and God knows what's going to be in that vaccine. Is it going to be built with or created with the cells of aborted fetuses? Is it going to have some kind of microchip technology inside of it that allows them to track all of our whereabouts, which also harmonizes very well with Bible prophecy, Revelation 13, 16 through 18. Nobody cares about things like that. It's like we've got to take this and we've got to take it now, and we're not even apparently going to be given time to have it tested. And the only way people would ever do something like this in terms of reaching out for this vaccine is if they're in a state of fear. So all this data that we've been covering here about Sweden and 6% and everything else, all of that is deleted from social media. It's deleted everywhere because they're lining people up to take this vaccine. Anyway, that's the way I see it. How do you see it?
Well, I find it very interesting, that article, from the New York Times, when someone seeks to analyze it, that gets screened on Facebook. So I don't know. I guess they think that if somebody goes and reads the New York Times article directly themselves, they won't be able to analyze it and come to that same conclusion. But anyone who tries to analyze it and either do a video or write a post about it, and then that gets shared, it's getting blocked on Facebook with one of those little posts that says this has been removed because it contains false information.
And not only is data being removed from decision makers, how do you make a decision? How do you make a decision unless you have data? I mean, if you're going out and buying a new car, don't you have to have data to make a proper decision? Well, how do you make any decision in life without data? And that's what they're removing from us. And the other thing is, when you're afraid, you don't think logically.
Right.
And I think a lot of people out there are just emotional because of the state of fear they're being worked into. And the government is sort of counting on the fact that they're not in a proper frame of mind where they can make a logical, rational decision. They would probably make an opposite decision if those emotions were different. And as all of this is happening, folks, I hate to tell you as an attorney, but the Constitution will not protect you. The problem isn't the Constitution. The problem is the liberal legal establishment interpreting the Constitution. Alan Dershowitz has already come out and saying the government can plunge any syringe into your arm whenever it wants to, and you have no constitutional rights otherwise. We have, on top of that, this, and we've quoted Dershowitz to that effect
Right.
in prior shows, but we have this article from the National Review entitled "The New York State Bar Committee Recommends Mandatory COVID Vaccine" by Wesley Smith, dated June 4th, 2020. It says here, a New York State Bar Committee just issued a report recommending that the influential legal organization endorse passing laws forcing everyone in the country, unless medically inappropriate, to receive the vaccine regardless of their own desires. And here's a quote from the law.com story. Do you mind reading that to us?
Citing a robust collection of federal and state case law, a New York State Bar Association task force group on Thursday said it should be mandatory for all Americans to have a COVID-19 vaccination when one is available, including those who won't want it for religious, philosophical, or personal reasons.
So there's and we could go on reading this. People can read that on their own, but you get the gist of it. The COVID-19 vaccination is coming your way, and the Constitution will not stop it. The Constitution will not protect you, even if you have a religious or philosophical or personal reason for saying no to the vaccine. And that flies directly in the face, in my opinion, of the Fourth Amendment, which specifically talks about the right of the people to be secure in their what? Persons. Not just their houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, but secure in their persons. And it says, shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons, it mentions it twice, or things to be seized. So the Fourth Amendment may say what it says, but Alan Dershowitz and the New York State Bar Committee and their recommendations saying the Constitution will not stand in your way should this mandatory vaccination to COVID-19 become available. And so, what does Daniel 7 say? He will change times and laws.
Yes.
And I think that's what's happening to the late, great United States of America. Anything I'm missing?
No. And I'm just kind of wondering what has changed, because even with all of the childhood vaccinations that have been added, we've always had the religious exemption. So, what has changed legally that they now, can go ahead and enforce this? Because in that article, it says they were citing a Supreme Court decision from 1905. Well, if that gave that authority, then why weren't all of those exemptions that have been honored in the 20th century, how were they continued to be honored?
Good point. And yeah, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, United States Supreme Court, 1905. What I find always interesting is these legal scholars they're never quoting the text of the Constitution.
Yeah.
They're quoting what some body of liberal judges said about the Constitution. Alan Dershowitz can say whatever he wants, but the Fourth Amendment still talks about persons.
Right.
The New York Bar Association can say whatever it wants, but the Fourth Amendment still talks about being secure, in your persons. And what do you need for the New World Order? You need a political arm, you need a legal arm, you need an economic arm, but you need something else. You need a religious arm. You need the voice of religion to come along and say, this is your Christian duty to take the vaccine. Very similar to the liturgy being changed in the United Methodist Church. The movement into globalism has always wanted to hijack the world of religion. And so what do we have here? An article from the Christian Post entitled 2,700 Evangelicals Warn Against Politicizing Coronavirus and Urge Christians to Take the Vaccine. And it says a coalition of more than 2,700 high-profile evangelicals spanning the fields of science and religion have signed on to a statement billed, quote, a Christian statement of science for pandemic times, close quote, which warns against politicization of the new coronavirus and urges Christians to take appropriate action against it, including taking a vaccine when it's ready. And so can you read that quote to us there?
We are deeply concerned about the polarization and politicization of science in the public square when so many lives are at stake. The word science has become a weapon in the culture wars. Scientists are vilified and their findings ignored, while conspiracy theories go viral. Sadly, Christians seem just as susceptible to these trends. Thoughtful Christians may disagree on public policy in response to the coronavirus, but none of us should ignore clear scientific evidence, end quote. The statement published online by the nonprofit organization BioLogos says.
So this is a Christian group, Christian organization, supposedly a Christian consensus, saying it's your Christian duty to take the vaccine. And this comes from a group called BioLogos. Let me give people a little bit of background on this BioLogos. I've been watching them and monitoring them for a long time. This is a group of people that has completely thrown in the towel to evolution. In other words, they think evolution is a scientific fact. And Bruce Waltke, sadly, an amillennialist now, that used to teach at Dallas Seminary, a Hebrew scholar, is signed on as part of BioLogos as their Hebrew scholar. And basically, it's this idea that evolution is true, and so let's throw in the towel to a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11. This is the same group behind this movement of evangelicals, all lining up saying it's our Christian duty to take the vaccine. So my point in bringing this up is this is the voice of the religious left, adding authenticity to this movement into the New World Order. Because at some point you've got to have Christian voices, virtue signaling.
Yes.
You know, the Pope, I think, is very strategic for them in this regard, telling everybody it's your Christian duty, warping the Bible. It's your Christian duty to sign up for this vaccine. In other words, if you don't want to take the vaccine, you're a bad person, and you're immoral, and you're actually a bad Christian. And in fact, I know of a particular case where a friend of mine, a devout Christian, has had his wife cornered at different times for not having her mask on. Oh, you're a Christian, you're supposed to have your mask on. Don't you believe in submitting to authority? That's the voice of the religious left, and they are an integral part in this one world system that's being developed. Now, the religious left, let me just give you a little bit of background on this. You remember when Mark Galli, and this comes from The Guardian, Evangelical Christianity Today calls for Trump's removal after impeachment. Mark Galli, supposedly working for a magazine that Billy Graham founded, came out and said, Trump should be impeached. Why don't you read that first paragraph to us?
The editor-in-chief, Mark Galli, wrote, quote, "The facts in this instance are unambiguous. The President of the United States attempted to use his political power to coerce a foreign leader to harass and discredit one of the President's political opponents."
So just prior, you can read the next one
Okay.
too, I'm sorry.
Continuing quote, "That is not only a violation of the Constitution, more importantly, is profoundly immoral," end quote.
So this is the editor of Christianity Today, a magazine founded by Billy Graham, coming out, and it made headlines, you might remember this, a few months back during the Trump impeachment, saying, it's the Christian duty to impeach Donald Trump. Well, it turns out he wrote this just before he retired. So he retires, And then we have this article from reformationcharlotte.org. Former Christianity Today editor renounces faith and becomes a Roman Catholic. In fact, we actually have a picture of him with his mask on, taking the Eucharist at the Roman Catholic Church. Mark Galli, a former Christianity Today editor and Trump critic, to be a confirmed Catholic. And I bring this up because I want to show people what an absolute liar this man is. And this is how the religious left operates. He writes an op-ed piece allegedly coming from an evangelical wanting to impeach Donald Trump. Then he retires from a magazine Billy Graham founded, and we learn he never had any intention of staying evangelical at all. He was actually a Roman Catholic at heart, and right when he retired, he switched right over to the Roman Catholic Church. But he sure didn't disclose his intentions there when he came up with the Trump pro-impeachment piece. And this is how the religious left operates. They're very deceptive. They're very manipulative. They're basically liars at their core. And they are being strategically used to give sort of a religious voice or a moral voice to leftism. Hey, it's the Christian duty to impeach the President of the United States. Hey, it's the Christian duty to take the vaccine. And so I hope people that are watching us will have some discernment when religious figures speak out on behalf of these issues and try to push our country in this sort of progressive direction.
Jude,
you're speechless.
Jude,
Yeah.
they're creeping in.
Certain men have crept in unaware.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got to, not everybody that stands behind a pulpit, preaches from a Bible, is doing God's work. In fact, does not the Apostle Paul say Satan comes as an angel of what? As an angel of light. This religion is a key ingredient to the New World Order, as we've tried to explain. It's a key movement towards getting people to think in a progressive manner. It's giving them the religious voice and permission necessary to speak in a religious manner, progressive manner. That's what this Mark Galli is all about. It's what this Bio-Logos group is all about. It's what these 2,700 evangelicals telling us it's our Christian duty to take the vaccine is all about. By the way, here's an article from Newsweek. More than 10,000 Christians, see the religious side of this?
Yes.
Call for the removal of Franklin Graham. He's the head of that group, Samaritan's Purse, which is a gospel and humanitarian group. More than 10,000 evangelicals, and I bet you a lot of the evangelicals that signed on to this were the same that signed on to the pro-vax document. More than 10,000 Christians call for removal of Franklin Graham as charity's CEO. Well, what did Franklin Graham do that was so bad? Did he commit adultery? Did he embezzle money? No. His crime is he prayed, or he gave a prayer supporting President Trump at the Republican National Convention. And this was written in Newsweek by Jason Lemon, September 2nd, 2020. It says, more than 10,000 evangelicals have signed an online petition calling on evangelical leader Pastor Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, to be removed as the head of humanitarian aid organization Samaritan's Purse, following his prayer in support of President Donald Trump on Wednesday. Can you read that quote to us there? It's a petition.
Yes. Unless and until you cut ties with Franklin Graham, his right-wing politics can only damage your credibility as a loving, Christian, humanitarian organization. If the full board will not vote to remove Graham as chairman, president, and CEO, then individual board members can take a personal stand for the gospel and offer their own resignations, the petition says.
So we've got the voice of the religious left saying, take the vaccine. The voice of the religious left saying, impeach Donald Trump. The voice of the religious left saying, get rid of Franklin Graham as the CEO of Samaritan's Purse. because of his ties to the president. He had the audacity to pray at a Republican National Convention. What a terrible thing, for a Christian to do. And my point is there's a religious climate that's now come into effect where they're assisting the New World Order. They're not combating it, which is what a Christian ought to do, but they're assisting it, and it goes right along with the legal system. And Alan Dershowitz and the New York Bar Association saying the Constitution will not protect you. So the way is being paved for what Bill Gates wants, which is we can't get back to normal until the whole world is vaccinated. Where am I going wrong?
You're not going wrong. What I'm thinking, Andy, because I have followed politics, I'm seeing a campaign here that's trying to influence the layman sitting in the pew at the church by demonstrating to them that there were 10,000 and what was the other number? 2,700. And then the prominent evangelical magazine, and then they're calling to cut ties with Franklin Graham. And that's not the biblical way that you would address an issue with Mr. Graham, correct? And so
you're talking about you'd talk to him privately first,
right? Yeah, and try to reach an agreement, and then come out with whatever the resolution is. But I really think what they're trying to do is affect the votes of the Christians that are sitting in the pews, and that they would see all of this and feel like, well, yes, he's in the wrong, and that Trump is in the wrong. So I'm just seeing a real campaign here.
Absolutely. Campaign's a good word for it. Well, real quick, let's go to number 5, global cultural Marxism. These last two, I think, we can do fairly fast. Global cultural Marxism, and I'm getting this from a Breitbart article. It's by James, I'm going to mispronounce this, Dellingpole, September 7th, 2020. It's talking about the United Nations and how everything bad in history was patriarchal's fault, or patriarchy's fault, claims the United Nations. We actually have this screenshot of a tweet from the United Nations itself, and it says the COVID-19 pandemic is demonstrating what we all knew. Millennia patriarchy have resulted in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture which damages everyone, women, men, girls, and boys. So they're coming out very clearly and saying, look, existing normal is the problem. It's patriarchal. So thanks to COVID-19, we've got to uproot its society, uproot civilization, and replace it with the new normal. So what does this particular article from Breitbart say about that?
No, really. According to the United Nations, the millennia of patriarchy, which gave us, among many other things, the Greek and Roman philosophers, Christianity, the Taj Mahal, habeas corpus, the art of the Renaissance, the collected works of Shakespeare and Goethe, Johann Sebastian Bach, penicillin, central heating, air conditioning,
yes,
the internal combustion engine, and space travel have actually been damaging to everyone. Also, according to the UN, we all know this. How does picking on men and blaming them for everything that is wrong square with that particular clause? And just how deludedly, monstrously arrogant would you have to be to declare that you know better how to order society and run the world in a non-patriarchal way, apparently, than pretty much every civilization in the entirety of human history? While the UN has long been a deeply suspect institution, it has not until now been quite so overt in pushing its hard-left, tyrannical, one-world government agenda of revolutionary change.
So, we're talking about street signs locally, Aunt Jemima syrup, things like this. Well, what we discover is this is actually a global push. That's just why I called this number 5 global cultural Marxism. This is all coming from the top. This is coming from the values of the United Nations itself. And what they are basically saying, it's classic cultural Marxism. They're just saying it from a global position that the current culture that exists is patriarchal.
Yeah.
And it's got to be uprooted and replaced with their model. And shame on that patriarchal society that gave us the Greek and Roman philosophers, Christianity, the Taj Mahal, habeas corpus, the art of the Renaissance, the collected works of Shakespeare, Bach, penicillin, central heating, air conditioning, the internal combustion engine, and space travel have actually been damaging to everybody. In other words, everything in current civilization, including these things, have to be uprooted and replaced. Now, that's not coming from the city council. That's coming from the United Nations, and this tweet, makes it plain. And so that's the mindset that we're drifting into. It's right out of Daniel 7, that the little horn would come and he would change times and law. And certainly we're seeing that. Maybe not that specific prophecy is yet being fulfilled, but we're seeing the stage clearly being set for the fulfillment of that. Anything you would add?
Yeah. So the UN, that anti-Semitic body.
Yeah.
All right. So many times patriarch and matriarch, when I've been hearing these terms, I've just in my mind connected male, female. But looking at this today and everything bad in history, I'm reminded of replacement theology and how, you point out that people that want to replace Israel want to get the blessings, but they never want to get the curses.
Right.
And then here, this is kind of the flip side, that it's all the bad that's in history is the patriarchs. And patriarch is just jumping off the page at me because I think of the Jewish patriarchs. So, as I'm reading through this, I'm just being reminded of this spiritual warfare.
And, we're living in a fallen world. In any culture, if you put it under a microscope, you can find problems. If you put my life under a microscope, you're going to find problems. But the issue is not, are there problems in current culture? The issue is, what do you want to replace it with?
Yeah.
That's what they don't tell you. In other words, they use this name progressive, which means progress. And every time you hear that expression, you need to ask them, what are we progressing towards? And Jesus in Matthew 12 talked about a man where a demon comes out of him. And the demon, goes through arid places, and he finds 7 demons more wicked than himself. And they re-inhabit the man. And the last state of the man is worse than the first. And that's always what I think about when I hear this word progress, progressive, putting current culture under a microscope. What are you going to replace it with? And I guarantee you, whatever they're going to replace it with, it's going to be 7 times worse. And they did this, the Marxists do this frequently. For example, you remember in Cuba, a man named Batista. He was a bad man. And the pro-Castro forces put his life under a microscope. The human rights violations he was involved in. And they got people into thinking we need to get rid of this guy. Well, what did they replace it with? Fidel Castro, who took Cuba and turned it into an island prison. And the last state was worse than the first. And they did the exact same thing in Iran. Remember the Shah? Now, you could take the Shah and his ruling, and you could put it under a microscope, and you could see his human rights violations. But what did they replace it with? The Ayatollah. And the last state was worse than the first. And that's essentially what's happening with all of this global cultural Marxism. I always ask the question out there, folks, what do they want to replace it with? Because we're living in a fallen world, and I could find flaws in any culture. Well, let's move to our last category here, or I may be tempted to start preaching. We want to look at the new morality, and this is just our final article. This comes from Fox35Orlando.com. New California bill would lower penalties for adults who have sexual relations with a minor September 2nd. Now, I've just been informed that this is no longer a bill, but tragically, it's been signed into law.
Oh.
But what does that little paragraph there say?
Okay, so as of the writing of the article, a new bill headed to Governor Gavin Newsom's desk would lower penalties for adults who have consensual sex with a minor if the offender is within 10 years of age with the victim. Senate Bill 145 passed in both houses of the state legislature late Monday evening. Quote, if signed into law, a 24-year-old could have sexual relations with a 15-year-old child without being required to register as a sex offender, end quote, State Senator Shannon Grove wrote in a tweet. The bill would not change the potential sentence for having sex with an underage minor. Instead, the bill would give judges the ability to evaluate whether the accused be required to register as a sex offender.
So now we're moving in the direction of pedophilia, basically. And I notice you have in your notes, and I've got it in my notes, the new Netflix movie called Cuties, which apparently is promoting, sex with minors as well. And, it's almost as if anything that's civilized, anything that's decent, anything that's normal in the area of sexual boundaries is being swept aside. I used to live in California, and I've followed California politics for a long time. And I've seen the state of California do some pretty sick things. But to me, this is the sickest, most disgusting thing I've ever seen. And that's quite an accomplishment for these people, because they're known for their sickness and their depravity. I'm not condemning residents of California. I'm condemning the governor and the legislature that would even contemplate passing into law SB 145, in both houses, which does this. And what's tragic, as the saying goes, as California goes, so goes the nation. The trends happening there will eventually sweep across the country. And as we've said before in Bible prophecy, America is in the way. And what better way to get America out of the way for the New World Order than to get America involved in this kind of debauchery and depravity and even certain companies. What was that company? Abercrombie and Fitch? Did I get that
Abercrombie?
right? Abercrombie and Fitch, I think is the name of it. They were sexualizing little kids, in their ads and fashions and things a long time ago. And it's tragic. And I'm going to make a warning here to people. This kind of thing that we would call the new morality, the setting aside of all sexual boundaries, right down to sex with a minor, is the identical thing that was happening in Genesis 6, bizarre sexuality just before the flood. And it was the identical thing that was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19, just before God rained down fire and brimstone on that city. And it was the identical thing that was happening in the land of Canaan before God commissioned Joshua to go into that land and eradicate the Canaanites. And if you don't believe me, go home this evening and read Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. And you'll see every perverse form of sexuality that the Canaanites were practicing, by the way, for 400 years, at least 400 years. God gave them grace for 400 years, and then Joshua came in and judgment came. Sodom and Gomorrah had grace for a certain amount of time. Fire and brimstone one day.
Right.
The pre-flood world, Noah, Genesis 6 verse 3 tells us that Noah preached for 120 years. They had grace for 120 years, and then finally the judgment of God came. If this type of trend continues, global judgment can't be far away. And I don't really see how our country can continue to exist as a civilized, free and independent country if this type of ungodliness and depravity is tolerated. It's not just being tolerated in our movies, Netflix, Cuties, our fashion, Abercrombie and Fitch, but it's also being put into the force of law in certain blue states. like the state of California. And I know they would never listen to a broadcast like this, but I feel compelled anyway to give a warning that God is not going to put up with this stuff for very long. And you better tread very carefully on the grounds that you're walking on now. Because as this comes out of Pandora's box, you can't erase it. You can't put the genie back into the bottle.
Right.
What would you add?
Well, what I would say is this kind of brings, in my mind, to the argument of homeschool or public school.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, do you allow your child to be in public school because you're going to be salt and light? To my brothers and sisters in Christ in New York and California, I think you are at a place right now where they're passing these laws. And as you say, God gives warnings and he also gives judgment. And you may not want to be there because New York allows, remember when they passed the bill to allow abortion clear up until birth?
Yeah,
and
infanticide, basically.
And New York is, if they were a nation, they would be 6th in the world in terms of the number of deaths from COVID. And California, they're legalizing pedophilia. I really think you need to get out of there. You know, but that's just my loving admonition, you know, to my brothers and sisters in Christ is, please consider this prayerfully.
Well, you know, James Dobson, it's interesting, has always supported public schools. And I remember very clearly in 2001, that's 20 years ago, he reversed himself and he said, the California system is broken. Yeah. It's irretrievable. Get your kids out. Now, that was 20 years ago. What would he be saying right now? I'm sure his voice would be saying the same thing, but a lot louder. Well, anyway, folks, have a nice day out there. Sorry to end on such a depressing thought. The good news of the whole thing, looking at our final slide, is that, look, yes, there's a global reset happening right now. COVID-19 and other things are being strategically used, but eventually the stone cut without human hands is going to shatter the Antichrist empire, and it's going to grow and grow till it fills the whole earth. And then Jesus is going to get his global reset. And evil's going to have its day in the sun temporarily. But you know, we live as people of hope because we know the future that God has. So anyway, that's a little bit about the global planetary reset, I guess. We've seen the progress of the critical race theory, the international and domestic crackdowns that have been happening due to COVID-19. That's why the Chicken Little mentality is not going away. And it's actually the UN that wants this global transformation. And it's even paving its way into the new morality, if you can even call it morality, which God will not tolerate much longer. Based on everything we know about the nature of God, you know, in His Word. Any concluding thoughts?
No, not along these lines.
So I would encourage people to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Our YouTube subscriptions have grown significantly, and so we thank you for pushing us into that high threshold. YouTube is free. And just click subscribe and the bell, and it will give you a notification every time we upload something. This presentation will be uploaded to YouTube momentarily. If you're watching this on Facebook and you have a share option, I notice people's share options have been disappearing. But if you have a share option, just click share if you could and expand us into your friends list if you believe in the message of this ministry. And next week, the 18th, I will not be here. I'll be traveling, but we're going to be back on Friday, September the 25th. Thanks so much for watching us, following along with us. Keep us in prayer as we keep you in prayer. And just pray that, you know, God's hand of protection would be on presentations like this, because we know that the enemy would like nothing better than to erase this from the world of social media and YouTube. So far, that hasn't been a problem for us. So we'll see you next time. God bless you. Thank you for watching.